Hey guys, thanks so much for watching this video on my Turning 65 presentation training. But before we get into this video, guys, I got to talk to you about my favorite telemarketing lead company in the Medicare or insurance-based industry, and that is Lead Heroes, guys. If you're doing final expense leads, Turning 65 leads, Medicare Supplement leads, Lead Heroes has got you covered. They represent everything that is good about lead vendors. They really do go above and beyond in terms of helping you get connected with high quality prospects that are, number one, interested in what you have to say. Number two, they qualify for your products. Guys, just because you watch this video, Lead Heroes is going to give you 10% off any order you make on their website. Coupon code can be found down in the description along with a link over to their website. Give them a try in 2021. Thanks for watching.
Okay. All right, so Medicare Advantage versus Medicare Supplement. This is how I would do it for a new client turning 65. Okay, so the way I always start in something like that is I'm going to pull up usually so you saw my appointment yesterday where I pulled up that chart, but sometimes if I'm sitting face to face with them, if I'm just going over general information, sometimes I'll just get out a piece of white printer paper and just draw it out for people. Because people are visual, right? Like people are going to be able to remember things more by seeing them than just hearing them. That's why I like to do the whiteboard stuff. So what I'll typically do is I'll draw out this little diagram here to where I'd say, all right, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, okay, Wanda. When you're turning 65 and getting onto Medicare, there's two ways that you can go with your Medicare, right? You have the Medicare Supplement route, and you can also go the Medicare Advantage route. You can't go both, but you can do one or the other. Bless you. You're fine. So you have the Medicare Supplement route, you have the Medicare Advantage route. In my opinion, I don't believe that either one is better than the other. I think they both have their strengths and weaknesses, but they're just different. So what I'd start with is I would start with the Med Sup because I feel like for most people, especially when they're turning 65, the Medicare Supplement is going to be a little bit more complex because it's very different than any other health insurance they've had throughout their life. So everything centers around Medicare Part A and Part B. So I'm going to take the time first to explain what A and B is to a brand new person. So I'd say, all right, Wanda, everything starts with Medicare Part A and Medicare Part B. Now, when you first get onto Medicare, those are the two parts of Medicare that actually come from the government. Prior to popular belief, everything else that you can possibly get typically is going to be coming from an insurance company. So when you have Medicare Part A and Part B, the nice way to think of them is they fit like two pieces of a puzzle that work together to give you medical coverage. You probably heard me say that 10 times this week, right? So that's a go-to for me because I think it's a powerful visual. They both cover different things, but they fit like two pieces of a puzzle that go together to give you medical coverage. So Medicare Part A most notably, right, covers the hospital. And typically, it's going to come with no premium. One of my criticisms I've had before, like when I was first getting my presentation down, is like they say you go into too much detail in Part A. I think that is a thing. I think sometimes it's better to keep it simple. But you can say, because every now and then, once in a blue moon, very rare, but maybe 1% of the time or less, you're going to run into people that necessarily might not have the working credits. So don't have to probably say it every time, but sometimes I'll slip it in there and be like, when you were working throughout your life, your FICA taxes were a paid for Part A. Because that's what it is. Medicare Part B, on the other hand, is going to give you your medical coverage. That's going to cover things like doctor's office appointments, same-day surgeries, durable medical equipment, things along that line, lab services, tests. And between the two, they're going to have deductibles and things like that, but most notably, they're going to cover you at 80% for these medical bills. Now, Medicare Part B has a monthly premium attached to it, right now, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, of $148.50 per month. So, and then I might slide, this is another thing too, like you don't want to get into too much detail, but you don't want to leave some detail out either. Because you never know how wealthy a client is, right? You don't know really what their income is. I've had people that have sat down in front of me that like, I would swear that they came from like a trailer and they're worth like $4 or $5 million, you know what I mean? And I just completely read them wrong. So sometimes I'll slip a little thing in there and be like, if you're in a higher tax bracket, sometimes they can charge you more. That's all. And then that opens the door to where if it's an issue, they'll bring it up. They'll be like, well, how much income? And then we can kind of talk about it. But most people, it's not going to be an issue. But that just saying that little tiny thing, I'm covering that base. So that's a question that I probably would, not a question, but just something I'd just slip in there. Now, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, now Wanda, since Medicare covers 80% of these medical bills, keep in mind, Medicare is pretty one-dimensional. It's going to give you medical coverage. It's not going to cover things like prescription drugs, dental, vision, hearing, some of these other things. So my job as a broker is to find you a plan or find you a way of doing this or a setup that's going to essentially fill in these gaps. So one way we can do it is we can go with a Medicare supplement, also known as a Medigap. So Medicare Supplement is essentially a secondary insurance that you pick up through a private insurance company. Think Mutual of Omaha, AARP, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, amongst others. And its primary job is going to be to come in and fill this 20% gap that Medicare leaves behind. The rule of thumb with a Medicare Supplement, Wanda, or who I'm talking to, is rather simple. As long as Medicare covers the bill first, the supplement will pay on the bill afterwards. It's going to be like a copycat insurance. If Medicare pays, it will pay. If Medicare doesn't pay, it's not going to pay. And so on and so forth. So since Medicare doesn't cover prescriptions, dental, vision, or hearing, guess what? Neither does your Medicare supplement plan. Now, if we're selling in here locally, which primarily you will be, sometimes I'll give them like a price range. You probably saw me do that yesterday, right? Mm-hmm. So for our market, I'd say depending on the supplement and depending on the plan you get, it's probably going to cost anywhere between $80 a month and maybe $130. Could be more, could be less. It just depends on the plan. I'd say a nice estimate might be $110. That way, if we end up doing a plan N or something like that, they're pleasantly surprised, but they're not disappointed if we go the G. Okay. Because that pretty much covers it either way. Now, anybody that's watching the replay, if you're in a different state, these numbers are probably not going to line up. But I do this because I want them to know right up front what they're going to pay. Like I don't want them to go through a 45-minute presentation with me and still not know what they're paying, right? Because I hate that when someone's trying to pitch me something. Yeah. I'm like, what is this going to cost me? Get to the point. So I'm getting to the point very early and often. It keeps their attention as well. Like if they're a little bored, right when they hear the price, they're going to perk up. Okay. What? Oh, this is what I pay? So the way I'd explain the supplement would be something like this. I would say, what I said earlier about, it's a copycat insurance. It's going to pay on a bill if Medicare pays in a bill. And I would also explain that, a Medicare supplement allows you to be double covered. So depending on the company and depending on the plan that you go with, you could potentially have full medical coverage or close to full medical coverage, just depending on the plan. Very little out-of-pocket whatsoever. In fact, Wanda, the most popular Medicare supplement plan that is on the market today has a one-time-a-year deductible of $203. After that point, you have 100% full medical coverage as long as it's a Medicare-approved charge. So that just kind of gives you an idea. And then I always tell that story about that client of mine that, I'd be like, years ago, I had a client of mine that turned 65 here in Utah. She had a bad year her first year. She had $150,000 to $200,000 worth of medical bills. She had this particular plan that I'm talking about, and she paid her deductible, not a penny more. She called me up the next year, and she was amazed. She couldn't believe it. That's the power of a Med Supp. So I would say that a Med Supp is going to be your top shelf coverage. It's the best medical coverage that money can buy. That kind of puts it into perspective in terms of what they're actually getting. Then, since Medicare and the Medicare supplement don't cover your don't cover your drug coverage, Enter Medicare Part D. And I always explain it like this. Medicare Part D is rather simple. Think about it like this. D stands for drugs. Medicare Part D plans are essentially just prescription plans, standalone prescription plans, pharmaceutical plans that you purchase through private insurance companies. So like a Humana or like an AARP or somebody like that. Depending on what you need and depending on what your prescriptions look like, they're going to cost somewhere in the ballpark of maybe $7 a month, maybe up to $50. Just depends on what you need. So I'd say a good estimate might be $20. It could be more, it could be less, just depending on what you need, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect. And of course, if you wanted dental coverage, vision coverage, hearing coverage, that's a separate plan in and of itself as well. And dental coverage, dental vision and hearing coverage is probably going to cost you somewhere in the ballpark of about $25 a month and $40. I'd say a good estimate for one of those might be $30. So what I'd tell the prospect by the end of this is I would say, so when you factor everything into it in terms of your costs, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, you're going to be looking at probably roughly about $300 a month, give or take. It could be more, it could be less, just depending on how we ended up doing this. That's probably what you're looking at when you factor everything into it. Then you remember how on my appointment yesterday I went through the positives and negatives of each side. Mm-hmm. That's really valuable, and I think that's very powerful for that because they remember those few key points very clearly. They might not remember all this other mumbo jumbo, but they're going to remember those key points. So I'd say, in my opinion, I think there's some positives and negatives to going this way. The positives would be, and we kind of talked about it a little bit, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, the medical coverage is top shelf. It's the best medical coverage that money can buy. Depending on the supplement that you go with, you could have full coverage or close to full coverage. The other thing that's a positive thing about a Medicare supplement, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, would be there's no networks. And a lot of times they're going to be working or on an ACA plan if they're turning 65 or something like that. I'd say, your insurance now has a network, right? They're like, well, what do you mean by network? What I mean by that is a list of doctors and hospitals you have to stay in the plan's network. They'd say, oh yeah, of course it does. I'd say, well, the nice thing about a Medicare supplement plan is there is no network. You can go anywhere to any doctor, any hospital in the country as long as they accept Medicare first. That's the only criteria. The insurance company doesn't matter at that point. And that's not just here in our home state, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect. That's coast to coast. That's all 50 states. It works the same in every state as it does here. Nowadays, probably 98 to 99% of doctors nationwide accept Medicare. So it's really finding one that doesn't is a needle in the haystack kind of deal. So essentially you can go where you want to go, almost every time. So you don't have to worry about networks. If you're traveling, it's very portable. And sometimes I'll slip it in, but sometimes depending on how their attention span is, I might not. But sometimes I'll slip in, a Medicare supplement in terms of coverage is never going to change. It's going to be the same coverage from year to year. It's going to be the same coverage in 15 years than the day you bought it. Mm-hmm. You don't have to worry about it changing coverage. But sometimes I won't even throw that in there. Sometimes I'll mainly hammer on the full medical coverage and the lack of network. And then I'd say, let's talk about the negatives, because there's definitely some of that. Every time I say that, they smile. They're like, here it comes, So I'd say the negatives of a Medicare supplement is this. I'd say for the average person on Medicare, it's probably pretty confusing because you have 3 to 4 different plans that you're having to keep up with, 3 to 4 different cards that all do something different, 3 to 4 different premiums that you're having to deal with on a consistent basis. For most people, it gets a little confusing and overwhelming when you're used to just having everything in one plan and paying for one plan. So that's a negative. It's a higher monthly premium than on the other side here, and we'll get to that in a second, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect. I'd say the other thing that I would consider as a negative, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, would be that, remember how I said the Medicare supplement would be roughly about $110 a month? They go, yes. I'd say, well, that's what it's going to be the first year. The Medicare supplement will raise your rate every single year as you get older, like clockwork, and they all do it. There's no way around it. There's very limited scenarios where a Medicare supplement won't raise the price. And so you would expect that to go up a little bit each year. Now, my job as a broker is to find you a plan that's going to go up as little as possible. We'd be looking at the trends. My goal always is to look at an average of about 5% a year over the long period of time. But there are some plans that have gone up 15%, 20%, 25%. We'd be trying to avoid that. But even a small rate increase still takes its toll over a long period of time. The last thing I would say is a negative, and I'd put this in the negative category because I do look at it as a negative myself, is when you're new to Medicare, when you're first turning 65, you are essentially you're open to Medicare window, where you can get any plan you want, no health questions, no underwriting whatsoever. And it's a straight shot. They can't ask you health questions, they can't look at your pre-existing conditions. But once you're outside of that new to Medicare window, opposed to just a few small scenarios, if you decided, let's say you wanted to start over here and then transition over here later, or maybe you didn't like your Medicare supplement and wanted to change to another one a couple of years from now, the new insurance company is able to ask you health questions, they're able to put you through underwriting, and if your health does not allow it, you might not qualify, and you might be stuck on your current plan in that regard. So I'll tell them that, make sure that they know that, but then I also will kind of ease that a little bit, because I know there's some agents out there that, you've probably seen this before. Have you ever seen agents that really use that as a fear tactic? And they'll really hammer that pain point home because they're trying to sell a med sup and they don't want them to go here?
Well, I mean, yeah, I see them, but I don't know if it's necessarily a fear tactic, but they're like, hey, so they see it as like a positive, where it's like, hey, you can't get underwritten, so you've had XYZ in the past. Yeah. This is a great opportunity to get 100% coverage, for just the monthly payment.
Right. And I think there's two ways to really explain it. Mm-hmm. I do feel like there's definitely some people out there that make it sound, they don't tell the whole story. Because there's a lot of shops out there that they'll sell med sup and they don't sell MA at all. So they're really trying to demonize MA, or they have an agenda for that. Not everybody, but there's definitely some of that going on.
Yeah.
And sometimes they won't tell them the whole story. So the way that I will put that into perspective is I would say, depending on your situation, normally I can find one that will take you. There's certain companies that ask a lot of health questions. There's certain companies that ask maybe not as many. Every company has different criteria. Now, that being said, I can never promise that I can take that I can get you on one. I can't ever guarantee that. Like if you have some real chronic issues that you're dealing with, like let's say you currently have cancer, or if you're on kidney dialysis, or if you just have been in the hospital a couple of times, things like that, I wouldn't be able to get you a plan with any insurance company. So there are situations like that, and they always understand that. They're like, oh, I get that, I understand that. But I'd say, opposed to a situation like that, I can normally find you something if it turns into an issue. But so I was kind of put that into perspective for them to make it not seem like that you can never get it later.
Okay.
Because I feel like there's a lot of people out there that whether the client maybe isn't understanding it, or maybe they're not getting the full picture, or maybe it's just presented in a certain way with an agenda, that a lot of them get the picture or the idea in their mind that no matter what, if they don't go with the supplement, they can never get it later.
Yes.
Even if they're perfectly healthy. And that's what we want to make sure we explain properly.
Yeah, and a lot of agents, you're right, do kind of make it sound like it's an all or nothing.
Right.
Yes.
And it's not the truth.
And it's,
if you look at the percentage of people that are completely not able to be underwritten, it's not a super high percentage. Most people can get something. But I always do make sure that I preface my comments by saying I can't guarantee that I can get you one.
Yeah.
Well, likely I'll be able to, especially if you're healthy now, but I can't guarantee it. Mm-hmm. So that's how I'd go over the Med Sup. Then I'd go over the Medicare Advantage. I'll just go over a little bit quickly because I want to make sure that I answer your question about the questions that I ask.
Okay.
But I'll take the time to do a pretty detailed presentation. So with Medicare Advantage, I'd say, okay, so I'd be like, do you have any questions on this side? They'd be like, oh, no, that makes sense. I went over the positives, I went over the negatives. I'd say, so let's talk about Medicare Advantage. And I'd always start out by saying, have you ever seen any of those Joe Namath commercials? Because it always just gives them the familiarity. Mm-hmm. And they'd say, oh, yeah, they're so obnoxious. I see them all the time. I'd be like, how about any of those $0 premium plan advertisements? They're like, I have a full mailbox full of them. They come every day. I'm like, well, I'm not surprised. And I'd say Medicare Advantage is definitely the more advertised product. The insurance companies, probably 99% of advertisements you're going to see nowadays are going to be for Medicare Advantage. And I'll explain why that is in a second. So with a Medicare Advantage plan, it starts the same as over here, as the Medicare Supplement side. You pick up your Medicare Part A and B. That part doesn't change. You still pay the Medicare Part B premium of $148.50. But instead of the government issuing your Medicare and paying 80% of your bills, or instead of running your Medicare through the government, you essentially run your Medicare through a private insurance company. And I'd say private. And so what that looks like, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, is essentially this private insurance company is going to be responsible for your claims. It's going to be issuing your Medicare for you. And they take over. They come in and they're responsible for paying your bills now. They're responsible for paying your claims. That's a very compliant way to explain it. Sometimes, and this is a little bit of a gray area, but sometimes I'll say, you've heard me say it. I might say doctors commonly refer to them as replacement plans, because they do. A lot of doctors' offices call them that, or managed care plans, or things like that. I'd be like, doctors commonly refer to them as replacement plans. I'm not supposed to use that terminology, but sometimes that's how they're commonly referred to. That's kind of like a gray area to where I'm not saying it, but I'm like, some other people call it this. You might hear your doctor call it that. I'm not supposed to say that, but you know what I mean? It's like me saying it without saying it.
Yeah, well, and it, as a new agent, it is kind of confusing, because you had clients come in the other day and they said, my mom's on a managed care plan. And I'm like,
you're like, what's that?
What's that? It's an Advantage plan.
And that's exactly what it is. They can walk into almost any doctor's office and they're not going to use the term Advantage plan.
Okay.
They will say replacement plan or managed care plan.
Okay.
And so sometimes you have to find a way to squeeze that in, so that way they know what you're talking about. Because if you just say this is a Medicare Advantage plan and they don't connect the dots, that's what they're talking about. But I would say, because this private insurance company is taking over and they're issuing your claims, and they're the ones paying fronting the bill, Medicare doesn't have to pay 80% anymore like they do over here. Well, that takes a big burden off of Medicare's shoulders. Would you agree? I always say that to kind of make sure that they're like not sleeping on me. And they go, yeah, I can imagine so. And I'd be like, well, Medicare in exchange agrees to fund this insurance company every month to take care of you. And they get quite a bit of funding at that. Depending on your source, a lot of sources say that Medicare Advantage plans get funded about $900 to $1,000 a month on average per person. And they go, wow. I'd say, well, that explains why you see all these commercials for it. The insurance company would much rather you be over here than over here, because they make a much higher profit margin. They go, oh, well, that makes sense. And I'd say, but then I'll take it. Then I'll come right back into it and I'll say, that doesn't mean that these are bad programs and they're the bad way to go. It just needs to put it in perspective to see that, hey, these are two different ways of doing it, but they're on equal playing fields.
Okay.
Because if you go with like a lot of the MedSup call centers, they'll paint the picture that this is great all the time and these are evil. And then like Joe Namath and all the commercials are saying this is great and these are evil. It's kind of like it's so confusing for them. So I like to really come from it from a perspective that they're equal. They both have their positives and negatives to them. And so what I would go to explain to them, and I'd be like, these plans are going to be probably more similar to any insurance you've had throughout your life. You're going to get your medical, you're going to get your prescription coverage included instead of having to get it separately like on the left-hand side. You're going to get, a lot of programs nowadays will give you dental, vision, and hearing benefits included, and a lot of extra things above and beyond what Medicare covers. Because they get all this funding from the government, typically the premiums on these plans are very low. In fact, it's very common, Mr. or Mrs. Prospect, for you to be able to get a plan for no premium. So like in our market, I say, probably 75% of the plans available in our market don't have a premium. And the ones that do are pretty minimal, $20 a month, $30 a month, $40 a month. And they're like, oh, okay. And And I'm like, of course, that's in addition to your Part B premium. But if you get a $0 premium plan, the only thing that you pay out in premium is the Part B premium. So then I'd write, maybe somewhere between $0 to $50. So I would then go into the coverage a little bit, and I would say the medical coverage isn't going to be quite exactly the same as what you're going to find on the left-hand side with the Medicare Supplement. Medicare Advantage plans, and then I would say, your plan now has a deductible, right? I think yesterday they said no on the appointment, didn't they, or something like that? Or did they say yes?
Oh, I can't remember.
There was one recently I did where I asked them that. They're like, no. I'm like, you're lying to me. Like that, like the first time in my whole career someone said no. I'll be like, usually it has a deductible, right, of $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a year. And they'll almost always be like, yeah, it has a deductible. I'm like, before it will pay for anything is substantial. Then I'd say, well, Medicare Advantage plans typically aren't going to come with deductibles. And there's one in our market that does, right? That
The Aetna?
Yeah, the Aetna plan.
Okay. Weber County School District, that administration, they don't pay a deductible.
Oh.
Yeah, their plan is like so sweet.
Sounds good.
Don't ask me how.
Anyway, so I would say, typically Medicare Advantage plans aren't going to have these deductibles. Instead, what they'll have on the medical side is copays. So you're going to pay copays for most things. An example might be, roughly around $5 for a primary care doctor visit. Maybe $30 to $40 to $50 for a specialist visit. Maybe $90 for an emergency room visit. Possibly $200 to $300 for an ambulance ride. If you spend the night in the hospital, typically what they'll do is they'll charge between $300 to $400 per day for the first 4 or 5 days. After that, they cover you at 100% for an unlimited amount of days if you're still in after that. So these copays essentially limit your costs. You pay more than what you pay over here, but you have a much lower premium, but the coverage is still fairly good. And these plans have maximum amount of pockets they put over the top, essentially to act as a safety blanket for you, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect. And with this safety blanket, they typically, so I'm talking about in our market, of course, for anybody watching the video, these max out of pockets are usually going to be somewhere between about $4,000 to $7,000 a year, roughly. And it's not a deductible. It's not saying that you have to pay it, but it's the most that your copays can equal up to be over the course of the calendar year on the medical side. If you ever hit that, they pay 100% for the rest of the year. So that's how I'd explain that, And then I'd say the things that we need to look at if we were to look at a Medicare Advantage plan would be Medicare Advantage plans, unlike supplements, do have networks of hospitals and doctors typically. So a lot of times they're built up of networks. Some plans have great big networks where you have tons of choices and where you can go. Some plans have itsy bitsy tiny networks where you just don't have a whole lot of choices. So I would say we'd want to pick a plan that covers your respective doctors. I'm always a fan of plans with bigger networks opposed to smaller networks. The other thing we'd want to check, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, is since this plan has your drug coverage included, we'd want to make sure that your prescriptions are covered and covered well on whatever plan we choose. We can run a comparison for that. The other thing is we'd want to make sure that your medical coverage is good and that your other needs are met. And I might say, how important is dental coverage to you? You might be like, well, I get my teeth cleaned twice a year. I've never had a cavity. I'd be like, okay, great. Probably not as big of a deal, Or, they'd be like, I have a root canal every year, something like that. Be like, oh, well, that's important. We have to make sure that this plan has some dental in. So I'll ask some questions like that to gauge beforehand. But then I'd go over the pros and cons of the Advantage plans. So I'd say the pros of an Advantage plan, the good about the Advantage plan would be the premium's low. That's pretty obvious, right? Opposed to over here. The other thing is it's probably more simple for the average person, right? You have one plan that really does everything. You have one card to keep track of for the most part. I mean, they have to keep track of their Medicare card, but they don't use it. You have one card that's going to keep track and that's going to be used for everything, at the pharmacy, at the doctor's office, at the dentist's office. And so that's probably simpler for the average person. The other thing is you get a lot of extra benefits that Medicare doesn't cover, right? Like you get the over-the-counter item essentials, transportation benefits. You get fitness. You get the fitness program, the gym programs. Yes, you get some plans now, like we've talked about this week, do a pretty substantial amount of dental, vision, hearing, right? So that's the pros of a Medicare Advantage plan the way I see it. Now let's talk about the negative, because there's definitely some of that. And they always chuckle a little bit. They go, yeah, everything has a catch. And then I'd go, the negatives would be if medically, if your health takes a turn for the worse and you have more medical conditions, if your health gets a little bit worse, the potential for you to pay more out of pocket is much higher here than it is over here. Because since you're paying copays for every usage, you can rack up the costs very quickly, opposed to a Medicare supplement. So that's a negative. The other negative I would say is these plans, Mr. and Mrs. Prospect, can typically change a little bit from year to year. So whatever plan you have today is not necessarily going to be what it's going to look like a year from now. Sometimes they're just minor changes. Sometimes they can be humongous changes. But the plans are not going to be the same from year to year. And the other negative I would say about this Mr. and Mrs. Prospect is the plan is built for our specific area. It's built for our service area, our state that we live in. So if you're doing a lot of traveling, it might have quite a bit of limitations outside of our state. So it's more restrictive in terms of where you can go and what you can use it for. So so I go through this presentation, and then what I would ask in terms of questions is I would say, do you have any questions, first of all? Because I don't want them to be confused. I want them to at least have enough of an understanding of what we're looking at between the two. Then if they say no, it's pretty straightforward, which usually they do. If I go through this presentation, I think that they'll typically get it, unless they're just not listening. Sometimes people just don't listen, right? No matter how well you explain it. But 99 times out of 100, they're going to say, no, it makes sense. So the question I would ask after that, to kind of determine which way am I going to go, is I would say, based on what we talked about, which side seems more attractive to you?
Okay, that's good.
I'm going to let them tell me. Like I always tell people that I would love for our book of business to be 100% med sup. The reason why it's not is because I take the approach of, I'll go where you want me to go.
Okay. So a question then that I have is, so you go ahead and explain both sides, and then you kind of ask what's, I guess, more appealing to them, instead of maybe asking like, and I know I mean, and I've seen you do it on other calls where you kind of gauge like what they value beforehand, but let's just say, like beforehand, because you've already kind of maybe felt them out, like, dental is important. They don't go to the doctor often, and they just like to, hang out at home. Like, do you still go through and explain sup versus advantage?
I typically almost always do.
Okay.
Like when they're turning 65. So like that guy yesterday, let's use him as an example. Like it was pretty clear from the get-go he wanted a Medicare Advantage. Because, he calls up, one of the first things he tells me is, I'm healthy, I go to the doctor once a year, blah, 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 right? There's a reason why I still take the time to go through this. Okay. And the reason is, because I probably could have saved myself a lot of time, right, and just jumped right into this. The reason why I didn't is because I don't want another agent to get in the door and say, oh, Christian didn't tell you about this, let me tell you about this. And it seems like I'm keeping something from him.
Okay, that's a great way to explain it.
Yeah, that's my biggest fear, because in the past, I've learned over the years, especially with turning 65 people, because what they really want is they want to know their options. They want to know their options. I feel like if I'm just really, only showing one of these two sides here, I'm limiting their options. I'm taking it upon myself to not give them the choice. And so even if it's clear to me which way somebody's going to want to go, like I can just tell, every now and then I'm wrong. Sometimes I'll think somebody wants to go here, and it end up wanting to go here because I do the presentation.
Okay.
But the main thing to me is because in the past when I've done that, when I've been like, okay, I'm sure this person wants to go here or here or here or there, and I'll just not talk about the other side, it seems like they come back later and it's a problem. Okay. But I didn't even know about this, you didn't tell me about this, or they end up leaving to go with someone else on the other side because they have this, and I feel like if I did the presentation like this from the beginning, that they would have still gone the same way, but they would be more comfortable with their decision. Whereas if someone comes in and says, well, let me tell you about this, you could stop paying all your copays today, and just pay a little bit of a monthly premium instead. What, your agent didn't tell you about that? That's too bad. That Christian Brindle's a jerk. Something like that. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah, it's that fear of missing out.
And I feel like by me doing this, it might take me a little bit more time in the appointment, especially for the T65s. Like that appointment yesterday was pretty lengthy. But I have basically almost a 0% chance, I feel like, of losing them.
Okay.
Does that make sense? I feel like it helps our retention.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, I think I told you, what was our retention? 97%? 97%, this from last year to this year. I want that to stay up there, even as we grow. And I feel like by us taking this approach, it's a little bit more of a pain in the butt. We have to do a little bit more work, but they feel confident and comfortable with why they're going the way they're going. And I feel like that's worth it. It's worth the extra 15 minutes or so it takes to explain the other side.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does.
But that's really how I do it, is I'll take the time to do a really thorough, detailed explanation with them. I'll draw it out like this. I'm only talking about generalities, right? So I'm not talking about carrier specific, anything like that. I'm just doing kind of like an educational presentation. And so by doing that, they feel incredibly comfortable about their decision. Because they're like, okay, I don't like all these working parts with the med sup. I don't like the extra premium, or I don't like the networks or the restrictions over here. I don't like the copays. They feel very comfortable with their decision because they saw the other side and they saw it, with the tarp pulled off. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's really what I do is, I'll do the presentation and then I'll let them guide me. I'll be like, based on what we talked about, which plan sounds more of a fit for you, what you're looking for, and they'll just go with it.
Okay.
Then, like, you saw me yesterday, we went into the Advantage plan, we got the scope signed, everything like that, and then I started going through networks. I'm like, where are your doctors at? I start getting into more specifics.
Yeah.
I think I asked him, I was like, how important is dental to you? That's a good question to ask. I'd say, do you take a lot of prescriptions? He's like, no, I just take one, torvastatin, So you ask these little questions as you go. But for the most part, it's not super complicated. I feel like the more complicated you make the process, I think the worse off you are.
Yeah.
I think if you can keep it a very simple process to where, like, I was talking to someone yesterday and they were like, I do so much better when I don't use a script. And I completely get it, because she's like, I feel like I'm just having a conversation with somebody. Like what I told her is, like, I feel like when you're new, a script can get you from point A to B to getting them to talk to you. But then after that, like, unless you have a script that's down to the floor, you're not going to know every single thing of how to, if you're following a script. You sometimes have to have a conversation with people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think people like genuine people.
Yes.
And I think that's a lot of it too.
Yeah.
Does that any other questions on this? Does that?
No, that helps a lot, because when because we've already gone over kind of the opening and getting your foot in the door,